the real Napoleon Bonaparte, and what do we truly know about him? Did he really come from nothing and conquer everything, as the tagline of the Joaquin Phoenix movie about him would have you believe? In this documentary from History Calling, we look at the rise and fall of the man who became one of the most famous military commanders in history and Emperor of the French, only to lose it all, regain it, and lose it again. We'll discuss his background, his experiences of the French Revolution, how he took control of France, some of his most famous battles, including the infamous Battle of Waterloo, his personal life, and of course, whether he really was as short as history would have us believe. This is the story of Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the island of Corsica on the 15th of August 1769 to Carlo and Letizia Bonaparte, the fourth of their 13 children, though only 8 would survive childhood. His family were of Italian descent, however Corsica was by this time under French control, and Carlo had sworn an oath of allegiance to the French king Louis XV, who he even met on more than one occasion. The Bonapartes were therefore comfortably off during his youth, but were not great aristocrats by any stretch of the imagination. While I wouldn't say that Napoleon came from nothing, his roots were certainly modest by the standards of pre-revolutionary France. As a child, he spoke Corsican as his first language, then learnt Italian, then finally French at school, starting when he was 9, though he always had a strong Corsican accent when communicating in that language. He was very intelligent, well-educated, and a voracious reader. He showed an early interest in military history, especially the achievements of ancient generals and conquerors such as Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, foreshadowing his own later career. His first 9 years were spent at home in Ajaccio in Corsica. Then he was sent to Burgundy in early 1779 to continue his education, and soon after to military school in Champagne, then another military academy in Paris, where he arrived in 1784 and spent a year. This drawing of him was done at around that time by one of his school friends. After his father died in February 1785, though, Napoleon quickly finished his education and joined the army that September, aged just 16. Carlo had left his wife and children with serious debts, and Napoleon, despite being the second surviving son, spent the next few years trying to pay them off. He was not well off during this period of his life, sending some of his earnings home to support his family and even skipping meals to save money. In July 1789, the French Revolution broke out. Napoleon was a member of France's army and had sworn an oath to King Louis XVI, but he was no fan of the French monarchy and supported its weakening and the rise of the National Assembly, which took control of the country. In August of that year, having just turned 20, he returned to Corsica for 18 months on an extended sick leave from the army, though he doesn't actually appear to have been ill. There, he tried to use the revolution to improve the island's prospects and was delighted in 1790 when the Assembly proclaimed that Corsica would remain part of France but be governed by Corsicans only. In February 1791, he finally returned to his regiment, where he continued to live the life of a very poor soldier, though his great-uncle died and left the family a small fortune later that year, which Napoleon put to good use by getting himself elected as an adjutant in the Corsican National Guard in February 1792. In doing so, though, he had left his regiment in Valence again and failed to return by the stipulated time, so that he was rendered a deserter. As revolution in Corsica heated up, he found himself in serious opposition to the French commander of the island's citadel, which Napoleon tried and failed to seize control of, and as a result of his actions, he had to leave his home once again. He now made for Paris. Here the revolution was in full swing, and the political situation was a mess. Despite his desertion and his antics in Corsica, Napoleon was promoted to a captain in the army in July 1792. By now, he fully supported the toppling of the monarchy, and he witnessed some of the most famous events of this time period firsthand, seeing the storming of the Tuileries in June 1792, where King Louis and his wife, Marie Antoinette, were being effectively held prisoner, and the massacre of their Swiss guards in the same location the following month. More bloodshed followed, and France was declared a republic in September, with the former Louis XVI sent to the guillotine on the 21st of January 1793, and his queen killed that October. The effects of the revolution had by this point spilled over into the rest of Europe. Prussia and Austria had invaded France in 1792, and in February 1793 France declared war on Britain and Holland, while Spain, Portugal and Piedmont, which is in Italy, declared war on France. Napoleon was by now fully supportive of the French Revolution and believed Corsica would be best served by being a French province, which was quite different to his earlier stance as a Corsican nationalist. More and more, though, he identified with France and French interests, and his competing loyalties ultimately led to his own and his family's exile from the island. Its government at this time, headed by a man Napoleon had once revered, Pasquale Paoli, were not receptive to the revolution, or increasingly to the Bonaparte family, whose home was raided in May 1793. Napoleon tried to take control of Ajaccio at the end of that month, but he failed, and in July his family had to leave the island for France. Corsica recognised George III of Great Britain as its king that same month. Napoleon now returned to the army to help support his family, and was soon sent to help retake the strategic port of Toulon from British, Spanish and Neapolitan forces. Despite his youth, he was put in charge of the French army's artillery, and it was largely through his fearsome organisation skills and military expertise that the campaign was successful in December. He was quickly rewarded. As his biographer Andrew Roberts says, and his book on Napoleon was my main secondary source for this video and is linked below for you, on December 22nd, 1793, having been on leave for 58 of his 99 months of service, with and without permission, and after spending less than 4 years on active duty, Napoleon was made, at 24, a general. This wasn't enough to protect him during this period of French history, though. I don't want to get too sidetracked here into the details of the French Revolution, but one of its key figures was a man called Maximilien Robespierre, and in 1794 Napoleon went on a mission to Genoa on behalf of Maximilian's brother, Augustin, who had earlier helped him publish a pro-revolutionary tract. Soon afterwards, the two brothers were arrested and ultimately guillotined by their political enemies in July. The following month, Napoleon himself was imprisoned in Nice, and then Antibes, by those who suspected his loyalties due to his connections to Augustin. Fortunately for him, he was soon released for lack of evidence. At around this time, he was courting a teenage girl called Desiree Clary. As always, please be kind if I mispronounce any person or place names in this video which are foreign to me. There are an awful lot of them in this one from all over Europe, and I'm doing my best. Desiree's sister had married Napoleon's brother Joseph in August 1794, and in April 1795 the pair became engaged. It had fallen apart by June, though, as Desiree pulled away from him, much to his distress. She, and I found this so random when I read it, went on to become the Queen of Sweden. Napoleon's career had almost stalled by the late summer of 1795, and he was briefly removed from the list of serving generals, but he got a job in the Topographical Bureau, which taught him the nuts and bolts of how to manage, move and supply a national army, and so he was in Paris ready for action that October when a new insurrection against the most recent of France's constantly changing governments broke out. Made second in command of the Army of the Interior and ordered to crush the revolt, Napoleon did just that, and with ruthless efficiency. His willingness to kill members of the Parisian mob en masse earned him a reputation for brutality. It also got him the command of the Army of the Interior and greatly improved his circumstances, not least because of his hugely increased salary. He had also got over the affair with Desiree remarkably fast, and by September 1795 was involved with another woman, named Vicomtesse Marie-Joseph Rose de la Pagerie, widow of Vicomte Alexandre du Beauharnais. Remember, we're being kind about my pronunciation. She was 6 years older than Napoleon and had been through the ringer during the Revolution, when her husband was guillotined and she was locked up in squalid conditions for several months in 1794 in a crypt beneath a Parisian church. She already had 2 children, Eugene and Hortense, and had taken several lovers during her widowhood. But Napoleon, who called her Josephine, didn't care. He fell in love with her and married her on the 9th of March, 1796. For her part, she didn't return his feelings to anything like the same extent, but her looks were just starting to fade, and she was a pragmatist who knew she needed his money and position. Though poorly educated, she had fantastic social skills and connections, great style, and proved to be in many ways an extremely able and valuable consort for him. She cheated on him, however, and drove him mad at times with her refusal to visit him for long periods when he was campaigning, or even write frequently to him, though he sent her literally hundreds of love letters when they were apart, and you can see one of them here. A week before his marriage, Napoleon was given command of the army of Italy, and just 2 days after his wedding, he was off to Nice, which was to be his headquarters. He then set about dealing with the Austrian and Piedmontese threat to the new French Republic, winning victories against their forces in 1796 and signing an armistice with them in late April, which was hugely favourable to the French. The following month, he engaged the Austrians at a bridge in the town of Lodi and beat them, allowing him to gain access to Milan before moving on with the goal of pushing the Austrians out of Italy entirely. He won victory after victory, showed great personal courage in battle and calmness under pressure, and humiliated the Austrian generals. He signed a peace treaty with Naples in October without the approval of the French government, which was known as the Directory, took Mantua after a long campaign in January 1797, forced massive territorial and financial concessions from the Pope through a treaty made in February, and negotiated and signed a treaty with Austria in April and another in October. There was a war with Venice, then a city-state, in May 1797, which was quickly won by France, and another treaty, this time with Genoa, soon after. Throughout this period, he also removed many of Italy's greatest artworks and the contents of some of its best libraries, and sent them to Paris, where many ended up in the institution now known as the Louvre. He was rather prone to acting without authorization, though, and his growing popularity and achievements began to raise questions as to what his ultimate ambitions were, though for now he pooh-poohed any ideas that he sought supreme power in France. His fame, not just in France but across Europe, meant that he was now known as a force to be reckoned with, though, both at home and abroad. Back in France, the Directory was falling apart in the face of economic woes and political infighting, and eventually it was overhauled by an event known as the Fructidor coup in September 1797, which had Napoleon's full support. He himself was now made commander of the Army of England and returned to Paris in December. He was received with delight by the people, but coolness by the powers that be, who remained concerned about his popularity and intentions. But at 28, he was still too young to have a seat on the Directory, as directors had to be at least 40. Despite his new role, he quickly decided that England's naval power meant that trying to invade the country at that point would be insane, and instead the Directory sent him to Egypt as the new head of the army there, and with the intention of trying to disrupt Britain's imperial interests and trading routes both there and in the Mediterranean. He left for Alexandria in May 1798 and arrived on the 1st of July, having dodged the British commander Horatio Nelson on the trip. The city fell to him within a day, then it was on to Cairo. En route, his army was attacked by the local Mamluk rulers on the 21st of July, in what became known as the Battle of the Pyramids, because these famous buildings were within sight of the fighting. Napoleon and his forces won a decisive victory and moved on to the capital the next day, where he instituted a large number of political and social reforms, but had to fight uprisings from the local populace in order to gain and maintain control. In early 1799, Napoleon set his sights on the Ottoman Empire and the territories ruled by Ahmed al-Jazar. He marched 13,000 men into Damascus, then into lands now in modern-day Israel and Gaza, where they engaged in the brutal sack of Jaffa, which is now in Israel, and the slaughter of thousands of its inhabitants. He then attempted to take the fortress of Akko, also in modern Israel, which was defended with the help of the British, but suffered a rare failure. Instead, he retreated back to Cairo in May, arriving in June, having had around 50 of his plague-ridden soldiers killed with opium overdoses along the way, as their illness meant they couldn't be put on ships. He viewed this as a pragmatic and humanitarian course of action, though. After putting down an invasion of Alexandria, he sailed back to France in August, once again without orders, and stopped off at his homeland of Corsica on the way. It was to be the last time he ever set foot on the island. When he returned to Paris, he met with rapturous crowds and managed to patch things up with Josephine, who he now knew had been cheating on him, though he had also cheated on her in retaliation whilst in Egypt and would continue to do so prolifically over the rest of their time together. Their marriage would ultimately come to an unfortunate end, but not for the reasons you might think. More on that later. The Directory was now on its last legs, beset by corruption and incompetence, deeply unpopular amongst the people, and so weak it couldn't even punish Napoleon for deserting his post in Egypt or for the losses he had incurred there. It was ripe for an overthrow, and in November he did just that. With the assistance of a group of other disaffected politicians and military men, the Directory was brought to an end and replaced with a consulate of 3 men, with a senate below them. At the age of just 30, Napoleon was installed as first consul for a term of 10 years, with sweeping powers and a huge salary. Soon, France was a dictatorship in all but name. It was the dawn of a new century, a new France, and a new chapter in Napoleon's life. The new order was legitimised by a plebiscite in January and February 1800, the results of which were heavily falsified in Napoleon's favour, though Andrew Roberts argues that he did have a genuine majority, just not as large a one as official records stated. Napoleon pushed through a huge number of political, social, legal and economic changes designed to make the new regime popular and to modernise France. These included limiting the amount of time a citizen could be held without trial, instituting pensions for war-wounded and soldiers' widows, allowing all but the most hardened royalist exiles to return home, and making the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, which had been the starting cannon of the Revolution, a national holiday. He also squashed the opposition to him, sometimes having them executed, shut down most of France's newspapers to control the flow of information, and reorganised national and local government to make it more efficient and ensure that the men staffing it were loyal to him. In time, he would also introduce a standardised legal code throughout the country, reform education, currency and the systems of weights and measures, and make peace with the Catholic Church, which had been severely repressed as a result of the Revolution. As for his living quarters, he and Josephine moved into the former palace of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the Tuileries, and within 18 months the household staff and etiquette around them was much the same as that which had governed Versailles under the monarchy. Napoleon didn't live his life holed up in a palace though, for no sooner had he moved in than war was calling again. The Austrians had invaded northern Italy once more and besieged Genoa, and Napoleon opted to take an army over the Alps in order to deal with the threat in May 1800, an incredible feat in itself because, have you ever seen the Alps? He decided not to rescue Genoa though, a decision Roberts calls ruthless because it was, and the city had to surrender in the end as its people were starving to death. Instead, he took Milan, which had a large supply depot. He ended up engaging the Austrian general Melas on the 14th of June at the Battle of Marengo, which the French ultimately won, despite some early setbacks. Napoleon risked his life on the battlefield, ensuring his troops could see him to keep up morale, even as bullets whizzed by him. The Austrians quickly agreed to leave northern Italy again in another great coup for the first consul, and a peace treaty was signed in February 1801. Before the year was out, further treaties were also signed with Britain, Russia, Naples, Turkey, and Bavaria. The Treaty of Amiens was signed with Britain in 1802 as well, ending the Revolutionary Wars, and another with Prussia the same year. In 1802, Napoleon was declared first consul for life, with the power to choose his successor, effectively making him a king and thereby reversing one of the core aims of the French Revolution. He started using his first name only, as monarchs do, but as he had no children, he had to look to his brother Joseph as an heir. At the start of that year, he had his stepdaughter, Hortense, marry his brother Louis, a disastrous union by the way, and when they produced a son in October, that boy too was considered a possible successor. In May 1803, the wobbly peace with Britain broke down. Napoleon invaded Hanover, the King of the United Kingdom was also the Elector of Hanover at this time, and prepared to invade England. This never happened though. In March 1804, however, he made a serious misstep when he ordered the kidnap and execution, after a short sham trial, of the Duke of Enghien, a member of the French royal house of Bourbon, who Napoleon wrongly accused of conspiring to kill him. The effect of this judicial murder was to revive French memories of the Reign of Terror during the Revolution, when many French aristocrats and royals were slaughtered, and it turned much of Europe's aristocracy, even those liberals who had previously supported him, against him. Nevertheless, despite the damage to his reputation, Napoleon was about to effect one of his greatest achievements, that of becoming emperor. It is quite bizarre that only 11 years after killing Louis XVI, the French should have allowed a new hereditary monarchy to be instituted, but that is exactly what happened. Already a monarch in all but name, he was declared emperor by the French Senate on the 18th of May 1804, with the decision underpinned by a rigged plebiscite, which he may well have won anyway. The title of king was deliberately avoided so as not to evoke further memories of the Bourbon dynasty, but otherwise the new Napoleon I differed very little from his predecessors in terms of his authority. His coronation took place at Notre Dame Cathedral on the 2nd of December and was officiated over by the Pope. Napoleon wore a laurel wreath crown and held another, a replica of that used by the famous Emperor Charlemagne, over his own head during the ceremony, signifying that everything he had gained for himself, but he didn't actually put it on as the golden laurels were in the way. He did crown Josephine though, who became his empress, and the following year the pair were also made the King and Queen of Italy. He soon raised his siblings and their spouses to grand heights as well. His sister Elisa was given the Principality of Lucca and Piombino, making her a princess. She'd later be Duchess of Tuscany too, and Countess of Compignano. His sister Pauline became Duchess of Guastalla, and his sister Caroline was made the Grand Duchess of Berg and Cleves in 1806. Then in 1808, her husband was made King of Naples, so that she became its queen. Despite not really being up to the job, and clearly only getting it because of nepotism, his brother Joseph was made King of Naples himself between 1806 and 1808, then King of Spain between 1808 and 1813, while his brother Louis, miserably married to Napoleon's stepdaughter, remember, was created King of Holland in 1806, and his brother Jerome was made King of Westphalia in 1807. His stepson Eugene was made the Viceroy of Italy. His brother Lucien disagreed with Napoleon's actions in making himself emperor, though, and preferred to live in exile in Rome. He also ended up in England for several years too, but he did return to his brother's side much later. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, though. Napoleon's siblings were not generally very grateful for what he did for them, and with the exception of Pauline, would not prove to be loyal to him either. But this was in part because he had a habit of forcing them into marriages they didn't want. In 1805, it was time for another war. Austria had invaded Bavaria, and once again Napoleon had to shelve his plans for trying to attack the English mainland in order to deal with this new threat. It was yet another sweeping success for him, and the Austrian general Karl Mack had to surrender at the Battle of Ulm in October. While the emperor was dealing with this situation, though, the Battle of Trafalgar was fought on the 21st of October, and the French fleet was mostly destroyed by the British. This battle established British naval hegemony over France, though it came at the expense of the life of British Admiral Horatio Nelson. The loss for France was offset by victory just 6 weeks later, when Napoleon and his forces crushed the Russian-Austrian army at the Battle of Austerlitz on the 2nd of December. The following year, he founded the Confederation of the Rhine, which brought over a dozen German kingdoms, principalities, duchies and grand duchies together, and spelled the end of the Holy Roman Empire, which was formally dissolved on the 6th of August that year by Emperor Francis, who was now just the Emperor of Austria. This brought on the ire of the Prussians, who declared war shortly after the Confederation's creation, but this proved to be an error on their part. The French dealt them two resounding defeats on the same day, the 14th of October, at the battles of Jena, which is where Napoleon was, and Auerstadt, where his general Louis-Nicolas Davout won. Napoleon and his generals then swept through Prussia, taking cities including Berlin and Magdeburg. The Emperor and his soldiers were reshaping Europe's borders and its politics by the year. One country he couldn't beat, though, was Britain, which continued to be at war with him. As he couldn't attack them by land, and he couldn't successfully attack them by sea, he sought to crush them commercially by passing the Berlin Decrees in November 1806, which placed the country under a commercial blockade, stopping them from trading with the continent. This damaged the continental economy, though, and Britain responded with orders in council, which put France under commercial blockade too, forcing all vessels going to and from there to stop in the UK first and pay fees. The blockade of Britain, which became known as the Continental System, also didn't work because even Napoleon's army needed some British-made products, including their very uniforms, and there was a raging black market which even his family was using. The emperor now marched into Poland, which didn't actually exist as a sovereign state at that time, and fought the Russian army at the Battle of Eylau in February 1807. This was not one of his typical triumphs, though, and though he said he had won, the vast loss of life, tens of thousands of men, made it something of a Pyrrhic victory. A much more decisive success against the Russians followed in June, though, at the Battle of Friedland, and within weeks Napoleon met with Tsar Alexander in person and negotiated a peace deal, the Tilsit Settlement, which divvied up Europe between the two countries and tore Prussia into pieces. His next campaign on the Iberian Peninsula was not so successful. Determined to hurt British interests by attacking their ally, Portugal, he sent troops into the country in 1807, and its royal family fled. Then, with Spanish politics in turmoil and infighting amongst its royal family, more troops were dispatched into that country in 1808. Its king, Charles IV, abdicated under duress, though he tried to take that back soon after, and rather than recognising his son, Prince Ferdinand, as the new king, despite Ferdinand's evident respect for Napoleon, the emperor, as we've already seen, put his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish wouldn't accept him as king, though, and fought back. In some cases, this took the form of guerrilla warfare. In others, it involved full-scale battles between armies. One such battle was that of Bailen in July 1808, in which the French were defeated, much to Napoleon's anger, he wasn't there himself, and things on the peninsula only got worse. Portugal was lost to the British that same summer, and the struggle to control Spain dragged on, absorbing huge numbers of troops that were needed elsewhere. In April 1809, the Austrians again declared war on the French and invaded Bavaria. Napoleon, who had been in Paris, travelled to fight them in person, winning the Battle of Eckmühl on the 22nd of that month, then retaking Vienna on the 13th of May. Defeat, his first in a decade, soon followed, though, at the Battle of Aspern 8 days later, shattering the perception that he could not be beaten. It was 6 weeks before he felt able to engage the Austrian army again, but at that point he did prevail at the Battle of Wagram on the 5th of July, though it was only at the expense of very heavy losses. Archduke Charles of Austria offered an armistice on the 12th of July, which was accepted, and in October, Francis I of Austria, who had been Francis II of the Holy Roman Empire, just to confuse matters, had to agree to the Treaty of Schönbrunn, which Roberts argues, quote, effectively reduced Austria to a second-rate power, end quote, by taking much of its territory, limiting its army and access to the coast, and forcing it to join the continental system. The issue of the succession to Napoleon's empire was now becoming more pressing than ever. Josephine had not had any children by him and was now too old to do so, but Napoleon had impregnated several of his many mistresses and so knew that he could reproduce. The Empress's grandson and Napoleon's nephew, the son of Hortense St. Louis, died in 1807 at the age of 4, and with him went one of the most obvious successors. Napoleon now found himself in a similar position to Henry VIII of England nearly 300 years earlier. He needed an heir, but he was married to a wife who couldn't give him one. He formulated the same plan to get out of the situation: annul the marriage to one woman and marry another, one who was much younger and who could give him a son. Unlike Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, though, while Josephine was heartbroken when he told her and begged him to reconsider, when he refused to do so, she ultimately submitted to the arrangement. He granted her a vast income and a clutch of beautiful houses to live in, wiped out her debts, and allowed her to keep the style of empress. The annulment, which really had no valid legal or religious grounds, was confirmed in December 1809, though Napoleon maintained for the rest of his life that he loved Josephine and would not have abandoned her if she had borne him a son. Still, even before the annulment was through, he had plans for who his next empress would be, and though he was interested in the Russian Tsar's sister, Anna, it was to the 18-year-old Marie Louise of Austria, daughter of Emperor Francis, that the 40-year-old was wed on the 1st of April, 1810. Less than a year later, in March 1811, she gave birth to their son, Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles, who was named King of Rome by his doting father. By 1810, the British Duke of Wellington had landed in Portugal, where French forces were struggling to deal with him, partly because Napoleon didn't send enough of them, and that summer he booted his brother Louis off the Dutch throne for not prioritising French interests over those of Holland. Relations with the papacy had broken down to the extent that the Pope had been imprisoned, and the economic problems caused by the continental system meant that it had to be relaxed, though not for Napoleon's Russian ally, Tsar Alexander. This was annoying enough for Alexander, but he was further offended because Napoleon hadn't married his sister, even though that was largely down to his own stalling, and because the emperor had annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, which was run by the father-in-law of the Tsar's other sister. Napoleon did this ostensibly because the Duke had been trading with the English, but then again, so was everyone, and if you haven't noticed yet, he wanted to control everything and everyone. Had he not been so greedy, in my opinion, and been content with what he had, the upcoming disasters may never have happened. The Oldenburg situation gave the Tsar another reason to begin plotting war against him, and Napoleon was about to discover that the problem with reaching the top is that the only way left to you is down. In 1811, the French were forced out of Portugal by the British. Napoleon's forces were stretched relatively thinly across Spain and elsewhere in Europe, and there was famine at home. It was not a good time to make war with Russia, but the emperor ignored the naysayers and began planning for one. It wasn't until 1812, however, that it began, by which point Russia was well prepared and had made alliances with Sweden and the Turks at France's expense. On the 24th of that year, Napoleon marched his massive army into Russian territory. Big mistake. Rather than engaging with the French, the Russians, for the most part, withdrew deeper and deeper into their country, forcing Napoleon's army to keep marching, even though they lacked the supplies and the supply lines to last for such a long time in a hostile environment. The scorched earth policy the retreating Russians employed also made it incredibly difficult for the French army to live off the land, and the weather was atrocious, alternating between baking sun and hailstorms that left the French soldiers wading through swamps up to their necks. Men and horses alike began to die in their tens of thousands from starvation, exhaustion, and disease. Others deserted and even undertook what was called self-destruction at the time. We have another word for that now, but I'm deliberately avoiding saying it, as the powers that be on this platform don't like it to be mentioned. Napoleon's forces did win the Battle of Smolensk, fought over 3 days in mid-August, but instead of stopping there, they made for Moscow. The Battle of Borodino, near Moscow, was fought on the 7th of September. The French won, but the cost was enormous. This was, quote, the bloodiest single day in the history of warfare, according to Roberts, up to that point, a title it would hold for more than a century. Napoleon now made his final approach to Moscow. His army entered the city on the 14th of September, and he arrived a day later. Rather than fight another battle for the capital, though, Russian forces retreated and most of the city's inhabitants evacuated before the French arrived. Once the French army was in, the remainder of the Russians then set fire to their own city in a repeat of the scorched earth policy that had been used in the preceding months, and having already destroyed much of the firefighting equipment in the city so that the French couldn't put out the blaze. This prevented much of the looting that would otherwise have taken place and killed even more French soldiers as they either fought to control the flames or succumbed to them as they ran or attempted to loot. Napoleon was forced to dodge the fires too, and admitted that he admired the fortitude and commitment of the Muscovites, saying that there was no precedent for anything like it in history. The scale of the damage made wintering his army in the city impossible, but he stayed for 5 weeks before leaving in the hope that the Tsar would offer peace. He didn't, and Napoleon later conceded that he ought to have abandoned the capital far sooner. Instead, it was mid-October when he set out, and though his initial plan should have had him back in Smolensk in 3 weeks before winter set in, he was forced into taking a longer route due to ongoing fights with parts of the Russian army, which further sapped his remaining army of their dwindling strength, and their blockading of the route he wanted to use. As a result of his detour, the French were caught in the infamous Russian winter, and the effect on his remaining troops was catastrophic. As the snow fell and the temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius, thousands died of cold and starvation. Many others were captured by the Russians, then tortured and killed, or self-destructed, you know what I mean, while they were on the march. Morale and discipline collapsed. The men began cannibalizing their dead comrades, and their artillery had to be abandoned along the way for lack of horses to pull it. The French army was in ruins. I've seen different figures given for the losses, but we're talking about something in the region of 500,000 men, plus horses and equipment. Napoleon left them on the 5th of December to travel back to Paris, where there had been a recent attempt to overthrow him, and where he needed to reassert his control. So let's just pause for a moment and revisit the tagline of the Ridley Scott movie starring Joaquin Phoenix, "He came from nothing, he conquered everything." I explained at the beginning of the video that I don't think he quite came from nothing, and I definitely don't think he conquered everything, though his achievements were nevertheless astonishing. He never set foot in the United Kingdom, despite desperately wanting to take the country for many years and trying to run it into the ground with a commercial blockade, and we could hardly say that he conquered Russia. Rather, I think that it conquered him in the end, given the destruction his campaign there wrought on his army and reputation. It's a great tagline, but this is why we don't get our history from the movies. Back in France, Napoleon tried to rebuild his army at breakneck speed, though it often involved pilfering from other French armies in Europe and bringing in poorly trained teenage boys to fill out the ranks. He made up with the Pope, but his enemies, otherwise known as the Allies, now formed what is known as the Sixth Coalition, consisting of Austria, yes, his own father-in-law had turned against him, Prussia, Russia, Spain, Britain, Portugal, Sweden, Sardinia, and some of the German states. The war they were about to fight against him would ultimately destroy everything Napoleon had built for himself. The War of the Sixth Coalition took place during 1813 and 1814. Sweden declared war on France at the start of March, and Prussia followed suit less than a fortnight later. Napoleon bolstered his Central European army by taking more soldiers from Spain, but this left his brother Joseph in a precarious position, as the Duke of Wellington was fighting French forces there, and soon enough Joseph was having to abandon Madrid, which he did in March. Napoleon fought the battles of Lutzen and Botzen in May and defeated the Allies, but only at the cost of many more thousands of soldiers. Peace negotiations during the summer were unsuccessful, and Austria declared war on him on the 12th of August. 2 weeks later, the Battle of Dresden was fought, in which the French beat a Prussian-Russian-Austrian army. The French now suffered serious defeats and losses though, not all of which Napoleon was present for. These were the battles of Grossbeeren, Katzbach and Kulm in late August, and Dennewitz in early September. Napoleon was with the army at the Battle of Leipzig, which was fought over 3 days in the middle of October, and it too proved to be a resounding defeat for the French. He was forced to retreat, having suffered, you guessed it, more heavy losses. An offer of peace, known as the Frankfurt Proposals, was made by the Allies in November, which would have kept the Emperor on his throne and more or less returned France to its natural borders, though most notably parts of Belgium would have remained under its control. The French people, weary of conscriptions and taxes, were keen to accept when they found out the terms, but Napoleon had dithered too long in answering, and the offer was withdrawn in December, in part because the British refused to allow him any part of Belgium, as it could have been used as a base from which to attack the United Kingdom. That same month, his brother Joseph abdicated as King of Spain. The stage was now set for France to be invaded, and for Napoleon to be overthrown. With a depleted army, many of whom were little more than children, and a population desperate for peace, French forces were no match for the overwhelming armies of the Allies. The Prussians and Austrians breached the country's borders in the middle of January 1814, and on the 25th, Napoleon left Paris to try to fight them off, never to see Marie-Louise or their son again. Despite a series of wins over the Allies, however, Napoleon was not able to hold them back forever, especially as many French towns were surrendering with little or no fight. At the Congress of Châtillon in March, the Allies offered peace if France would revert to its 1791 borders, so no Belgium, but Napoleon found this unacceptable and refused. By the end of the month, Paris itself, which had been poorly prepared for a siege by his pretty useless brother Joseph, was taken. Joseph himself, as well as Marie-Louise with her child, fled. On the 2nd of April, the French Senate deposed Napoleon as emperor, and the Allies restored the Bourbon royal family, with Louis XVI's brother becoming Louis XVIII. The dead king's equally dead son was counted as Louis XVII. This was the nadir of Napoleon's life, and on the night of the 12th into the 13th of April, he took poison. He was saved, of course, or the video would end here, but it shows how low his spirits had sunk. He signed an abdication document, and though he asked to be sent to Britain, he was exiled to the Italian island of Elba a week later, where he was allowed to keep his imperial style, so he was to be Emperor of Elba, though in reality he would be a prisoner. He was granted a generous financial settlement for himself, on paper at least, the reinstated royals didn't actually pay it, and his family were also provided for, though Marie-Louise never joined him, having been taken back to Austria by her father's forces and given 3 Italian duchies to sustain herself and her son. His mother joined him in exile, his sister Pauline visited, and an ex-mistress, Marie Waluska, brought his illegitimate son Alexander to see him, but otherwise the rest of his family had effectively abandoned him, and his wife soon took a lover. What was meant to be a lifelong exile in fact lasted less than 10 months. Seeing that the new king was not making himself popular, enraged at being separated from his wife and child, bored sitting on his island and worried that he was going to be sent somewhere far worse, Napoleon had decided by February 1815 to try to take back his throne, and on the 26th he escaped with a small force on the brig Inconstant. He landed back in France 2 days later and started heading north. As he went, he picked up more troops loyal to him and disenchanted with the king. When Louis heard he was coming, he fled Paris, where he had little support, and went to Belgium. Napoleon arrived in the capital on the 20th of March and retook his position as Emperor of the French. This reign, though, was to be exceptionally short, and is known as the 100 Days. Napoleon had been declared an outlaw by the Congress of Vienna, which was a meeting of the Allies, and it was certain that they were not just going to let him retake France. There was surely a battle in the near future. His brothers Joseph, Lucien and Jerome were welcomed back into the fold, though Marie-Louise stayed away and asked for a separation, and Napoleon began to seriously rebuild his army, partly relying, as Andrew Roberts points out, on the fact that conscription would now work better than it had the previous year because the French had had a taste of a restored Bourbon regime and found they preferred the Napoleonic era. The Allies declared war on the 15th of May, and the inevitable battle came on the 18th of June. It is so famous it even inspired the pop group ABBA 150 years later. I'm speaking, of course, about Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo took place in modern-day Belgium and was fought between Napoleon's forces on one side and the combined forces of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian Prince Blücher on the other. Wellington had been able to choose the battlefield, and Napoleon underestimated the forces he would face. He didn't expect the Prussians to arrive, as he'd battled them just 2 days earlier at Ligny and then split his army up by sending some of his forces to pursue them. The battle started at 11 a.m, and for a time it seemed like the French might win. As the Prussian reinforcements arrived, though, in the late afternoon, the advantage swung to Wellington, especially as the French made a number of strategic errors. The fighting was still going at 7 p.m, but an hour later the French soldiers began to retreat in a haphazard style, sensing that they'd lost. Napoleon agreed, and he left too. It was the end of the battle and the end of his glory days. Upon returning to Paris, he discovered that he had lost the support of his people and his government, and on the 22nd of June he abdicated again, intending the throne to go to his 4-year-old son. It did not. Louis XVIII was reinstalled, and Napoleon, who had hoped to go to America this time, ended up surrendering to the British and was exiled again, this time to the remote island of Saint Helena in the southern Atlantic, much to his chagrin. There he spent the remainder of his life, living mostly in a house there called Longwood, which was not kept in good repair and led him to complain about his conditions. He wrote his memoirs and a book on Caesar, before ultimately dying on the 5th of May 1821, aged 51, most likely of stomach cancer. His last words were reportedly, "France, the army, head of the army, Josephine," showing that he still loved the woman he'd thrown over a decade previously. He was buried on the island, but in 1840 King Louis Philippe of France had him returned to that country, and his remains now lie in the crypt under the dome at Les Invalides in Paris. It had certainly been an extraordinary life, and it is little wonder that this former emperor continues to fascinate even to this day. Let's finish, though, with one aspect of his story which still arouses much debate: his height. Napoleon is famous for having supposedly been quite short, but is that true? Sir Neil Campbell, the British commissioner charged with guarding Napoleon on Elba, described him as such in 1814, though he was hardly disposed to be complimentary to one of Britain's great enemies. Yet Sir Pulteney Malcolm, who guarded him at Saint Helena, said he was taller than expected, which admittedly is not the same thing as being tall. His height was recorded as being 5 feet 2 inches in the pre-metric French system, but that would be around 5 feet 6 inches by today's measurements, which was perfectly respectable for a man of his era. Nevertheless, disputes remain as to the truth, and while I think he was probably closer to the 5 feet 6 estimation, we'll never really be sure unless we dig him up, which we're not going to do. If you've enjoyed this content, please remember to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and you can also find links to my social media in the description box below. Let me know in the comments if you've seen or want to see the movie about Napoleon, and until next time, keep learning.